Steam NextFest has returned and brought us a heap of new demos to check out, which means, of course, that Dumpster Man is the one and only channel giving you unbiased and unfiltered opinions on... What's that? SkillUp already reviewed, like, all of these demos? Shit. This year's NextFest felt like it was hitting critical mass in terms of the hype for some of the games among its offering. Maybe it was just its proximity to the totally not E3 Summer Game Fest. Maybe it's just that bigger and more exciting games are starting to realize the potential of just putting your game in prospective buyers' hands. Either way, whatever the reason, it was awesome to see all the hype that games like Selaco and Gloomwood, for example, got from this event. And coverage from bigger publications and YouTube channels has gone a long way to legitimize NextFest as a serious landmark event in the gaming landscape that people should be paying attention to. I've been keeping a close eye on and covering every Steam NextFest since last year, and even just combing for demos on Steam more often when the event isn't going on. And I'm excited to once again give my thoughts on some of the best and most interesting demos I checked out as part of this NextFest. I try to keep my thoughts as unbiased and unfiltered as possible, but that said, with limited time, I only really played demos that seemed interesting to me at face value. And while I liked most of what I played, some of them didn't quite land for me. I encourage you to check out any demos you might be interested in for yourself, regardless of what I say about them. There's really nothing to lose but just a bit of hard drive space. Anyways, let's get into it. It should probably go without saying at this point, but my favorite demo in all of NextFest was for a game called Selaco. My original plan was just to make one video, this video, encompassing all of the demos that I wanted to talk about. But then I felt Selaco was good enough that it justified its own video talking about it. And then the video took an interesting turn. Anyways, if you want to watch that, I'll leave a link. But even if you don't, my only message is just, please, play this fantastic game. It's a fear-inspired shooter built in GZ Doom, and it is just unbelievable what the devs have accomplished. And it has skyrocketed itself up to one of my most anticipated upcoming games. Please, just play it. Interestingly enough, Trepang 2 is another game that has a lot of Fear's DNA in it. Much like Selaco, however, presentation-wise, these games could not be more different. Trepang 2 is a tactical stealth FPS where you have a few interesting powers to help you get through encounters with hordes of vigilant enemies. Admittedly, I haven't played Fear. I am hoping to change that soon, but Trepang 2 is what I imagine to be the closest thing possible to a modern iteration of Fear, given what I do know. The gunplay was good, the stealth was solid, and there was a lot of interesting and immersive options for getting through encounters. And the powers at your disposal, like going invisible or slowing down time, were promising, but something that I'd like to see expanded on more in the full game. As polished and AAA as this game looks, this was actually probably my biggest complaint about the game. The environments were pretty generic looking, and I didn't feel like they delivered on the awesomeness of the gameplay. The game had fleeting moments of truly beautiful set pieces, but if you look too closely at anything, it starts to look pretty generic and drab quickly. If this is the biggest knock to the game, I think it will still be great. And it is possible that the assets for this game are still being worked on, and some of this is stock placeholders. I don't know for sure, but I can only hope that the end product will be a bit more appealing and unique visually. Otherwise, Trepang 2 has extremely promising gameplay that I think will make for a fun game, if nothing else. Man, Cultic just rules. I've actually known about this game for a pretty long time. I even had the demo installed and planned to play it as part of a previous demo stream, and for whatever reason, I just didn't get around to it. I realize I'm kind of outing myself here, but the truth is that I knew Cultic was going to be good, and I knew that I would like it. But honestly, when I saw that the demo had been updated for this NextFest, I knew the time had finally come. And it turns out the game was even way better than I expected. Cultic is pretty obviously a love letter to Blood, but I think even if you haven't played Blood, full disclosure, I haven't, I know, roast me in the comments. The game will definitely stand on its own for people who like retro FPS games of really any kind, like Dusk or Herot or just really anything. The game's equipment, weaponry, and environments were designed with so much care, and everything just feels so full of life and little interactions and secrets, things like that. You can flush objects down the toilet, you can set dynamite traps and shoot them to set them off, you can bunny hop quickly by kicking in midair. Cultic is just a game that feels like everything was designed with maximum fun in mind. It's also just beautiful looking with great pixel art, models, and even some voxel objects and environments, but that all just blend together in a really cohesive way. Man, it's actually really hard to sum up why Cultic is so great other than just listing all the little things that are great about it, which is why I kind of think you need to just play it. It just feels incredible to play, and everything just feels put together with so much care. I'm super excited for when this game sees a full release. I went into Metal Hellsinger with an open mind, but I just couldn't get into it in the way that some other people seem to have. On the surface, this idea is not completely original, a combination of an FPS and a rhythm game. Great FPS games have often been likened to rhythm games when everything clicks and they feel really fluid, so the marriage seems natural. However, Metal Hellsinger felt anything but. Maybe people who play less FPS games in general will actually be more able to appreciate the novelty of this game, but since like well over half of what I play is FPS games of some sort, Metal Hellsinger felt incredibly unnatural to me. Like trying to sync your activities with the beat of a song is so distracting that in my opinion, it completely detracts from the things that make FPS games fun, for me at least. The real unfortunate thing of it is that if you take away the rhythm aspect of this game, I don't honestly think that you're left with a great FPS game. A competent one, and a pretty one, sure, but a great one? Not really. I think a lot of things have been simplified and dumbed down so that the game makes more sense in a rhythm game environment. So with that in mind, it feels like your mileage with this game is going to depend heavily on if you like that rhythm aspect or not. I wouldn't say the musical aspect of the game is without flaws either. At low health, the song becomes muffled and it becomes harder to intuitively click along with the beat, which just leads to frustration in my opinion. Especially if you're already struggling, it can really snowball you into failure. The way the game makes up for this is just doubling down on the big distracting rhythm game happening in the middle of your screen, which didn't appeal to me much. I wanted to like this because I respect the creativity of the idea, and unfortunately, it just didn't land for me. I can fully recognize that a lot of thought and effort has gone into this game, and with full recognition that this demo seemed to click for a lot of people and has a lot of hype surrounding it, I don't want to sway you from trying it if you think you might be interested in it. I wanted to like it, but the concept of a rhythm game FPS hybrid was probably dead on arrival for me despite my best efforts, and Metal Hellsinger did unfortunately little to change my mind. This NextFest might be the best advertisement for GZ Doom since, like, Doom? Apocalyptic Vibes is another GZ Doom-based game that just totally exceeded expectations. Seriously, the versatility of this engine is just staggering. Apocalyptic Vibes is an atmospheric, post-apocalyptic FPS with RPG and stealth immersive sim elements. It wears inspiration like Stalker and early Fallout on its sleeves, while still managing to be very unique and interesting in its own right. The game is still fairly rough overall, but giving credit where it's due, I was incredibly impressed by the polish and scope of the gameplay systems, especially when it came to the RPG and immersive sim stuff, at the very least, and trust that the ways in which the game is still lacking can be addressed before the final release. The warning that I will issue here is that if you aren't interested in a game that is just going to throw you in the deep end without much in the way of tutorials, you might struggle here. The only difficulty level available in the demo is comically called easy, but make no mistake, this game is punishing as fuck. The first combat encounter is actually so difficult that I thought I went the wrong way. I didn't even have enough bullets to deal with all the enemies. But I quickly realized that the game was trying to teach me something. I honestly didn't even know that stealth was a component of this game at first, but once I snuck past the first group of enemies, I found some side paths to get the drop on other enemies, I realized what type of game this was. Maybe I should have realized when my save point was a bonfire, but yeah, this is a game where you will probably die a lot, and you will overcome challenges through planning, careful execution, creativity, and some trial and error. Even if the combat isn't your cup of tea, the atmosphere and exploration is absolutely fantastic here, and a real accomplishment within GZ Doom. With all that in mind, I still think there's a lot of improvements that can be made here for this game to really live up to its massive potential. For one, the map was a little confusing and empty. This might be a problem exclusive to the demo. I love the exploration aspect, but sometimes doors just led to nowhere or didn't even open, without a "this door is locked" prompt or anything like that. I like the game's lack of handholding, but I wouldn't mind if it at least softly guided you the way you're supposed to go a little bit better. Like with creatively placed lights, more sound cues, things like that. The weapons in combat felt pretty good, but headshots felt kind of inconsistent, especially when I was sometimes counting on them for quick stealth kills. And finally, this may be addressed in the full version, but at least in what I was able to play of the demo, enemy variety was a bit lacking. This wasn't a huge issue, at least in the relatively short demo, as combat encounters still felt unanimously tense and varied, but I'd love to see more variety in the full release. All in all, this game is a huge triumph and probably the sleeper hit of NextFest in my opinion. If you like any of the games I compared this to, you will undoubtedly love Apocalyptic Vibes. Please check it out. Angerfoot is just a dose of pure fun. I kind of went into this game thinking it would be like Hotline Miami, but in 3D, and it kind of was, but it also kind of wasn't. There was definitely aspects like picking up enemies' guns on the fly, managing their ammo, and then throwing them when they're out. But Angerfoot is all just built upon this absolutely absurd and goofy foundation of movement and combat based on kicking. You can even fly up in the air and kick using both feet. And the physics too, things just go flying when you kick them. It's an extremely fun game to just mess around in, but it also seems like a game that will be a decent and potentially deep challenge as well the further you get into it. I love the aspect of getting new shoes with unique powers. I hope there is some risk and reward and different possible builds, sort of like the masks in Hotline Miami provide. But some of the shoes available in the demo felt straight up better than others, but definitely still led to interesting variations in playstyle, so I can give that a pass. All in all, I think Angerfoot is going to toe a fine line. I didn't expect the demo to get as difficult as it did at points, but the underlying fun and goofiness of it all kept me wanting to mess around with this game. This is a fun concept and an extremely promising demo that I can't wait to see fleshed out to a full game. I have a bit of a complicated relationship with roguelike FPSs. I love roguelikes and I love FPS games, but the marriage of the two has never really produced great results for me. I did enjoy games like Gunfire Reborn and Tower of Guns, but I just always felt a little bit like they could have and should have been better than they were. I think the real reason is because FPS games are just at their best with carefully crafted enemies, arenas, and weapons, and the randomness of roguelikes can really produce all sorts of undesirable results. So with that in mind, Deadlink is actually a really good and interesting take on this format. I like that the classes have set weapons, and the arenas are, or at least feel, handcrafted. The build variety largely comes from augments that you can assign to trigger on certain actions, like reloading your gun, swapping weapons, breaking an orb, etc. It's actually a really neat and creative way to encourage players into the style of play that the game wants for you, but also to allow some experimentation and reward creativity. The game also just feels really good and controls well already. My biggest complaint is mainly only that the environments and arenas are pretty samey, but I'm imagining that these will be more varied upon full release. Otherwise, this game is insanely fun, and the ideas here have a ton of potential to make a great game. People who like FPSs with interesting weapons and ability combos and theory crafting builds and interactions will undoubtedly love this game. Fashion Police Squad was actually a game that was not on my radar at all until I saw a trailer for it just before NextFest began. It's a retro-styled FPS, but also kind of not. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it's almost like a parody, I guess. You don't actually kill anything. You shoot your poorly dressed enemies to give them a makeover, essentially. The concept is hilarious, and it gets stretched in all sorts of ways that are both ridiculous and make sense within the premise. And from it comes weapon combos and synergies, power-ups, movement abilities. It's just cool, fun, and charming. I could see this game's shtick wearing thin, stretched over a full game, but I was pleasantly impressed by what was there so far. My biggest complaint was that, for one, the controls when it came to the belt swinging sections were really, really bad. I kept accidentally letting go, and I couldn't understand why, and then I eventually just accidentally got through it without this happening. Maybe it was a me problem, but yeah, that was just confusing. I also found the weapon synergies boiled down often to just use this weapon on this enemy without much nuance. I'd like to see the concepts introduced in the demo explored in more depth, as I imagine they will. And at the very least, Fashion Police Squad offers a decidedly unique take on a retro shooter and is definitely worth checking out for that alone. I'm of two minds on Agent 64. That this is both a well-made game by passionate developers and certain people out there will absolutely love it, and that it is also absolutely not for me in the slightest. I've played GoldenEye 64 before. I don't have an immense amount of nostalgia for it, but I have played it. And my general opinion on it is that, as influential and important as it was, FPS games have generally developed for the much, much better from it. Now, I've been critical of games that are really just updated and reskinned Doom and Quake clones, and while I haven't seen a GoldenEye clone before this, I feel like I must stay consistent here. I also kinda don't like it. I almost never play FPS games on controller, and maybe I would have the intended nostalgic experience if I had, but the keyboard and mouse controls are just awful and a bad experience for me. Now, this is by design, as an attempt to replicate the feeling of playing early controller-based FPS games like GoldenEye, and the developers did a good job in theory, but for me, it just didn't translate to a good experience. I think the lengths that the developers have gone to create an authentic but updated GoldenEye experience are clearly commendable, and if that sounds like your sort of thing, by all means, check this game out. Part of me wishes that talented developers like this would aim higher than just recreating old experience, but if there's an audience for it, hey, so be it. It's just not for me. I was initially drawn to Diluvian Ultra because of the awesome art style. I actually played a previous demo of this game that was pretty rudimentary to say the least, but that at least introduced some pretty promising gameplay concepts, and I was excited to see how these had developed over time. I was pleasantly surprised at how far the game had come from that previous demo. There was multiple pretty expansive levels, an interesting story, solid pacing and tutorialization of the game's mechanics, and the combat system shown off in the previous demo actually fleshed out here. I still think Diluvian Ultra has a ways to go though before it reaches its full potential. For as great as many of the individual concepts are here, I found the game felt like it was undergoing a bit of an identity crisis. There were so many different colored pickups, drops, switches, things like that combined with the game's maximalist biological horror or biopunk style, it got extremely overwhelming to follow everything that was going on. I also got lost several times looking for a switch that was hidden in some nook somewhere. I definitely felt like wayfinding could have been improved at minimum. When the combat was clicking, it was great. There was cool concepts like having to combine armor damaging and health damaging weapons to kill enemies, the ability to use some ammo from your armor gun to actually heal your own armor. But there was just so much going on overall that some of the things that the game was actually doing excellently were kind of getting buried in the noise sometimes. I'd love to see more enemy variety as well. I think one of these levels literally had only one type of enemy in it, and maybe a little more intuitive way of showing which enemies were armored. All in all, I think Diluvian Ultra will be great when all is said and done. It has too much going for it to not succeed, and I hope that the feedback from this demo will make the game as great as it deserves to be. I'm rooting for this one because if nothing else, the art style is stunning and the developer clearly has some awesome ideas that I'd love to see come together fully. Deck builders are an interesting case. It honestly seems like being even remotely competent and looking kind of like Slay the Spire is enough to get at least 1,000 reviews and a very positive score on Steam, whether the game really deserves it or not for the unique things it brings to the table. So fans of card games and deck builders, it seems, will probably be keen to try Beneath Oresa anyways. But I still feel like it's worth mentioning that this one has some pretty cool ideas going for it. If the cartoony style of some of these games isn't your cup of tea, you might favor Beneath Oresa's animated action-style combat sequences controlled by your cards. But it isn't just eye candy. There is a nice system where your card's effects can vary based on your actual proximity to enemies, and it adds layers of strategy to your encounters that I haven't seen in other games. That said, there was a lot of complex systems at play here, and many of them were not super well explained. I always liked how in Slay the Spire, if you couldn't remember what a status effect was, you could just hover over it and see what it does. I feel like Beneath Oresa could benefit from a system like that as well, since there was symbols that I didn't figure out the entire time I was playing the demo. The UI could maybe use another layer of polish as well. All in all though, it's refreshing to see a deck builder that actually feels like it's doing something a little different with the formula, and if nothing else, the action style presentation of the combat will undoubtedly win over some players. Moonscars is one of those games where you can tell just from looking at it where its inspiration is coming from. Souls games and modern Metroidvanias like Hollow Knight and Blasphemous. Admittedly, I am a sucker for this type of game, and I was keen to try this regardless of how well it differentiated itself from its inspirations. But I'm happy to report, Moonscars is totally awesome in its own right. The story was a bit nonsense, at least from what I experienced so far in the demo, but the combat was extremely fun, and the demo teased a massive tree full of possibilities with spells, powerful attacks, and much more to mix in with an already pretty fun and fluid 2D platform-based combat. Moonscars is a game I will undoubtedly return to. The gameplay is fun, familiar, but just unique enough to leave its own stamp on the genre, and the art style is beautiful. Maybe my only critique from the pretty short demo is that while the depressing and desaturated art style absolutely works for the game in general, even just in the demo, it was already leading to some samey and indistinguishable environments, and I'm worried that expanded to a full game, it will be hard to distinguish areas and create memorable and varied regions with this art style. Time will tell on that, but for now, Moonscars showed me everything I wanted to see out of a game of this type to know that I'm incredibly hyped to try this when it releases in full. Honestly, the biggest knock that I can give to Rusted Moss is that it withholds its best element and its defining feature until a ways into the demo, the grappling hook. Now granted, it only takes like 10 minutes to get your hands on the grappling hook. But on the other hand, grappling hook. Rusted Moss is basically just a Metroidvania game with guns and one absolute unit of a grappling hook. There isn't really much more to say about it other than that it's at least good at pretty much everything else it's attempting to do, and then the grappling hook just ties everything together beautifully. Using the grappling hook actually feels skillful and doesn't just completely trivialize movement. It's also integrated into the combat system when it comes to traversing arenas and dodging enemy attacks in a really cool and not at all gimmicky way. The weapons feel solid. I liked how the weapons had alternate or charge attack fire modes. I did find it slightly cumbersome that the weapons had such a limited range, but I think it will be possible to increase this in the future, and I ultimately got used to it and felt it made sense in the flow of combat overall. The story of the game felt odd and maybe even a little generic, but a 1 hour or so demo is usually not enough to evaluate the story of a game like this, so we'll just see where that goes. All in all, Rusted Moss was a really pleasant surprise. A late addition to the list of demos that I played for this NextFest, but one that I'm glad I snuck in at the last minute.
Hit that like
This is
button.
alright.
Smash that bell. Hit that bell button. Hit
Destroy my
bell
pussy.
Subscribe to Dumper Man.